It was a night that nearly tore my world apart. It had started so innocently, a quiet Friday evening at home with my husband. It was one of those nights where you look forward to unwinding after a long week, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful night with the person you love. We were sitting in our living room, sipping wine and talking about random things. The air was warm, the wine was good, and everything felt calm, like nothing out of the ordinary would happen. It was one of those nights where you're thankful for the simplicity of being together, where the outside world feels distant and insignificant. But then out of nowhere, my husband brought up a topic that caught me completely off guard. Casually, as if he were asking about the weather, he asked if I had ever thought about being with other men. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. At first, I thought it was a joke. I laughed, expecting him to laugh too, but he didn't. His expression stayed the same, serious, focused. I felt my heart rate pick up as I tried to process what he was really asking. He wasn't talking about just any men. He specifically mentioned black men and suggested 3 of them. The room seemed to close in around me, and my mind struggled to grasp what he was implying. I felt a rush of discomfort and confusion. Who just comes out and says something like that? I waited for him to crack a smile, to let me know he was kidding, but he didn't. His expression remained calm and serious, as if he had just asked about what we should have for dinner. I felt a chill run down my spine. Part of me wanted to believe it was some weird, harmless fantasy he was sharing, something that we'd laugh about later and then forget. But the way he looked at me told me it was more than that. He wasn't joking. I felt a sense of unease settle into my stomach. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a passing thought, but as the days went by, he kept bringing it up. At first, it was little comments, teasing remarks about what it might be like, hints dropped into conversations that felt uncomfortable and out of place. I felt my skin prickling every time he mentioned it, but I didn't know how to react. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, hoping he'd eventually drop it, but instead, his suggestions became more direct, more specific. He even started mentioning people he knew, friends of his. He insisted they were cool guys, and that it would only happen if I wanted it to. He painted it like it was no big deal. Just something for fun, something that could spice things up between us. I felt my stomach twist every time he brought it up, the discomfort growing into something darker. Anxiety, resentment, even fear. Part of me wanted to confront him, to tell him how deeply it bothered me. But another part felt afraid of what might happen if I did. I didn't want to start a fight. I didn't want to blow up our marriage over what I hoped was just a misguided idea he'd eventually forget about. But every time he mentioned it, I felt the distance between us growing. One night, he took it further. He suggested we meet these 3 men. He framed it as a casual hangout, like it was no big deal, just a night out with friends. I felt my pulse quicken, my body tensing up. I hesitated, sensing this was another attempt to push me into something I wasn't comfortable with. But in that moment, wanting to keep the peace and hoping I was reading too much into it, I reluctantly agreed. We met them at a local bar. From the moment we walked in, I felt nervous energy building inside me, like I was walking into a situation I wasn't prepared for. The men seemed nice enough, polite, charming, and maybe even a little too friendly. But there was an awkwardness in the air, a tension that I couldn't ignore. It felt like they knew something I didn't, like there was an unspoken understanding between them and my husband. My unease only grew, and I could feel my stomach twisting as I forced myself to smile and engage in small talk. As the night wore on, the drinks kept coming, and the conversations grew more intimate, more flirty. I felt myself growing more uncomfortable with every passing moment. One of the men kept giving me these lingering looks that felt like they were stripping me down. Every time I felt his eyes on me, a knot tightened in my chest. I glanced at my husband, hoping to find some kind of reassurance, but instead, he seemed completely relaxed, like he was enjoying the whole scene. He watched me with this smile, like it was all a game, like he was thrilled by the attention I was getting. Eventually, my husband suggested we all head back to our place. I didn't want to, but he insisted, saying it would be more comfortable to hang out at home. I felt my heart drop, a wave of dread washing over me, but I went along with it, hoping things would stay innocent. But as soon as we got back, everything shifted. The atmosphere changed, becoming heavy and charged. The men sat on the couch, joking around, but there was an underlying tension that felt almost suffocating. I retreated to the kitchen, hoping to get some space and clarity, but one of the men followed me. He came in close, standing just inches away from me. I could feel his breath on my neck as he reached for a dish towel. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a mix of fear and confusion. I tried to act casual, but his presence was overwhelming. He leaned in and whispered something in my ear. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard enough to know he was making a move. This wasn't just a friendly hangout anymore. I glanced toward the living room, hoping to see my husband coming to check on me, but he was nowhere in sight. He had to know what was happening, but he didn't seem to care. I felt trapped, alone. The man's touches were subtle, testing, like he was feeling out how far he could go. My body tensed, and my mind raced. Should I tell him to stop? Should I call out for my husband? But what would that look like? Would it start a scene, a fight? My thoughts were a whirlwind, and I felt frozen, unable to decide what to do. His touches became more lingering, his presence more invasive. Fear gripped me, but there was something else too, a confusing mix of emotions I didn't understand. Was it fear, excitement, or something else entirely? It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing the fall would be terrifying, but also feeling the pull of the unknown. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. This time, I heard him clearly. "You look like you want this." That was it. His words snapped me out of my frozen state. A surge of anger and panic rose up within me, and I backed away, bumping into the counter behind me. My hands gripped the edge as I tried to steady myself, my heart racing, and my mind screaming that I needed to get out of there. The counter pressed into my back, the cool surface feeling like a harsh boundary between me and the man who stood too close. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest like a drumbeat, and my breath felt shallow, catching in my throat as I struggled to maintain my composure. I needed to put as much space between us as I could without making a scene. The room felt stifling, and I could feel the heat rising in my face, a mix of anger, fear, and embarrassment that made my skin burn. My instincts screamed at me to put an end to this, but my mind was a whirlwind, and I couldn't figure out what to do. I glanced toward the doorway, hoping desperately that my husband would walk in, that he would sense something was wrong and intervene. But the doorway remained empty. He didn't come. The realization struck me like a punch. He wasn't going to step in because he was the one who had put me in the situation to begin with. I was completely on my own, steeling myself. I pushed past the man, forcing my way out of the kitchen and into the living room. My husband was there, laughing with two other men, as if nothing was amiss. They didn't notice the turmoil boiling beneath my skin, the panic that clung to me like a second skin. My husband looked over at me and smiled, and I couldn't tell if he was truly oblivious to my distress or if he was fully aware and simply didn't care. That uncertainty was enough to make my stomach churn. I felt my pulse quicken, my nerves fraying as I struggled to understand how he could be so blind or so indifferent. I sank down onto the edge of the couch, my fingers gripping the cushion so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My thoughts spun, replaying the moment in the kitchen. I kept seeing it in my mind, how close things had come to crossing a line that I wasn't prepared to cross. I felt a sharp pang of fear, and with it, a wave of anger. I wanted to speak up, to tell my husband that this wasn't fun for me, that I was scared, that I didn't want any of this. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat, trapped by the weight of everything I was feeling. The night stretched on, each minute dragging like an eternity, every laugh and clink of a glass echoing in my head. The men continued drinking, their laughter carefree, while my husband carried on as if everything was perfectly normal. But nothing about this was normal. Every time I thought back to the kitchen, My fear morphed into anger. How could he put me in such a situation and then just sit there, acting like it was no big deal? How could he be so casual, as if my feelings didn't matter at all? I felt the tension build inside me, simmering hotly beneath the surface. When the men finally decided to leave, a wave of relief washed over me, lightening the tight knot in my chest. I watched as they made their way out the door, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe. But even as they left, the tension remained, humming beneath my skin. As soon as the door closed behind them, I turned to my husband, his smile still plastered on his face like he was proud of himself, like he had pulled off the perfect evening. The sight of him like that made my anger flare, and I knew I couldn't keep silent any longer. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "What do you mean?" he replied, looking genuinely confused, as if he didn't know exactly what I was talking about. "That," I said, gesturing toward the door where his friends had just left. "That whole thing. What were you thinking?" He shrugged, his casual attitude only fanning the flames of my anger. "It was just a bit of fun. You didn't have to do anything you didn't want to." My mouth dropped open in disbelief. "Fun," I repeated, my voice rising. "You call that fun? You put me in a situation where one of your friends was all over me, and you just sat there like it was nothing." His face changed then. The smile faded, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Realization, maybe. But instead of apologizing, he grew defensive. "I thought you were into it," he said. "You didn't stop him." The words felt like a slap. Because I didn't know how, I snapped, the emotion spilling out before I could stop it. "I didn't know what to do. You're my husband. You're supposed to protect me, not throw me into situations like that." The argument dragged on, stretching out painfully as I tried to explain how uncomfortable I had been, how close things had come to crossing a line. But he brushed it off, his tone dismissive. He kept insisting that it was just a fantasy, that I could have stopped it at any time, but he didn't get it. He didn't understand how trapped I had felt, how powerless. Each time he spoke, his words felt like another wound, making me feel more and more alone. By the time the argument finally ended, I was shaking with anger and exhaustion. He stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me standing alone in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of a night that had almost destroyed everything. I stared down at the wine glasses and empty bottles scattered on the table, remnants of a night that had gone so wrong. I felt a knot of betrayal tightening in my chest. How could he be so oblivious? How could he not see the way he had put me at risk? I had trusted him to look out for me, and instead, he had put me in a situation where I felt completely powerless. I needed to move, to do something, anything, to distract myself from the anger and hurt. I walked into the kitchen, hoping that cleaning up would help me calm down. But even as I scrubbed at the dishes, my hands shook and my heart continued to race. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The way he had looked at me when he suggested I play along. The way his friends had looked at me like I was some kind of prize. And then, in the kitchen, the way that man had leaned in close, whispering things that made my skin crawl. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, unable to move or speak. I hated myself for not standing up to him sooner, for letting it get as far as it did. After washing the dishes, I stared out the window into the darkness. The house was quiet, but it felt empty, cold. There was no comfort in the silence, only a growing sense that something had shifted between us. Something fundamental had broken, and there was no way to ignore it. He had crossed a line, and I knew there was no going back. I took a deep breath and made my way to the bedroom. He was already there, lying on the bed, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. He didn't even look up when I entered. I stood there for a moment, staring at him, wondering how he could be so unaffected. How could he not see what he had done? Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." He glanced up at me, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" he asked, like he didn't already know. "About tonight," I said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "About what you did." He sighed, setting his phone down with an exasperated look. I already told you it was just a bit of fun. You didn't have to do anything you didn't want to. I shook my head, the anger rising inside me again. You don't get it. You put me in a situation where I felt trapped. You didn't care about how I was feeling. You were too busy trying to live out some fantasy. He frowned, sitting up. I thought you were okay with it. You didn't say no. I didn't know how. I snapped, the words rushing out. I didn't know how to say no without making things worse, without ruining everything. I trusted you to look out for me, and instead, you put me in a position where I almost did something I'd regret for the rest of my life. He looked away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might finally understand. I waited for an apology, for any sign of remorse. But when he spoke again, his voice was cold, dismissive. You're overreacting. Nothing happened. You're making a big deal out of nothing. That was it. I felt something snap inside me. I couldn't keep pretending that this was okay, that our marriage was okay. I stood up, grabbing my phone and heading for the door. Where are you going? He asked, his voice sharp now. I need some space, I said, not looking back. I need to figure out what I want, because right now I don't think I can do this anymore. He didn't respond, and I didn't wait for him to. I walked out of the bedroom, down the hallway and out the front door, stepping into the cool night air. I stood there for a moment, taking deep breaths, trying to calm myself. As I looked up at the stars, I realized something I hadn't seen before. I had been so focused on him, on trying to make him happy, that I had lost sight of what I needed, of what I deserved. I wasn't going to let that happen.